Yes, a former United States president owned slaves. Nowadays, saying the word slavery can make some people shift uncomfortably, and rightfully so. The term slave is considered dehumanizing. It's a word weighted with pain and injustice, which should always be handled with care, especially around those victimized by it. For some, slavery is like an awkward family secret, something they just rather sweep under the rug of history. But here's the harsh reality. Slavery isn't just a distant memory. It's a wound that still aches in the souls of millions. Picture this. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, countless Africans were snatched from their homes, ripped away from everything they knew and loved, and treated worse than animals. It's estimated that around 12.5 million Africans were forcibly shipped to the Americas, with over 10 million enduring the horrors of the transatlantic journey. Think about the toll it took, not just on the individuals torn from their homelands, but on entire communities, families, and cultures. It's a dark chapter in history that can't be erased or ignored. So let's delve into it together, exploring how slavery shaped the lives of Africans and African Americans, and why it's so crucial to remember and learn from this painful past. Welcome to Black History Diary, a space dedicated to revealing and honoring the vast tapestry of African heritage. The start of slavery in North America can be traced back to 1619, when a privateer known as the White Lion brought 20 enslaved Africans ashore in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. These 20 enslaved people were Angolans, whom the Portuguese colonial forces had kidnapped. Virginia was an isolated British colony at the time, just newly founded in 1607. These first 20 enslaved people disembarked at Point Comfort, today known as Fort Monroe, where English colonists immediately bought them. Sadly, most of the names of these people and the exact number of those who never left Point Comfort and Virginia have been lost to time and history. When the White Lion brought these 20 people to be sold, he sold them for food. African Americans would tell you that they are most affected by slavery, and that's right. Their ancestors were taken from their homes, stripped of their identity, and forced into a life of servitude. Today, many still carry the name of their enslavers put on their ancestors all those years ago. It is definitely no longer 1619, and the news is that slavery is long gone, but the effect is tethered to humanity forever. Sure, no one in recent times has been enslaved like Black people were. But the teachings that have been passed down to African Americans today came from what their great-great-grandparents learned through slavery. So, slavery has made a significant impact on an entire race of people, where we have consistently recurring self-esteem issues, a general distrust for law enforcement, insecurity, anxiety, and in some cases, a fear of society itself. This ignited a stereotype where Black people didn't want to be themselves. They'd rather be anything but Black. That stereotype has changed a lot since the 1960s, and African Americans today are proud of their race, skin color, culture, and how we speak, just like Africans are proud of their heritage. It is easy to say that Africans are not affected by slavery because they were not forced to leave their continent. However, they suffered a different type of slavery at home. It was given a not so bad name: colonization. Colonization was another form of slavery, plain and simple. It wasn't about chains and ships, but it was about domination, exploitation, and the stripping away of autonomy and dignity. When European powers set their sights on Africa, they didn't come with benevolent intentions. They came to conquer, to claim land, resources, and people as their own. They drew imaginary lines on the maps, dividing up a continent rich in culture, history, and innovation as if it was theirs for the taking. And let's not kid ourselves. They didn't see Africans as equals. Instead, they painted them as uncivilized, as if centuries of rich civilizations, thriving communities, and complex societies counted for nothing. Africans were treated as commodities, their labor and resources plundered to fuel the ambitions of colonial masters who lived like kings while the people they subjugated suffered. And when these indigenous people rose to take their freedom, they were met with stiff oppression from their colonial masters. One example of this is the Bamileke War, from the Cameroonian War of Independence, or the Hidden War. When the Cameroonian people tried to break free from the French colonization and establish a socialist economy, the French colonization tried to neutralize it. The result? Riots led to a war that resulted in over 61,000 to over 76,000 civilian deaths, according to estimates from the British Embassy. with 80% of the dead being from the Bamileke region.
Soldiers of the Cameroonian army were ordered to kill the men, but not the women. Women would be left to agonize.
Some estimates say that the number of deaths goes into the hundreds of thousands or even millions. But we never know the exact number because the French administration never kept records of the number of people that were killed.
The officer who was with me was here to be on the lookout and make sure no one would witness what was going on.
Maybe colonization is not exactly slavery, but it would not be right to minimize the pain that Africans went through when they were colonized. The people who lost their lives did so because they wanted to be free, because they wouldn't conform to Western colonization. So, while the chains of slavery might not have bound Africans on their soil, the shackles of colonization were just as real, just as oppressive. It's a painful truth that must be acknowledged if we're ever going to fully understand the legacy of injustice that still reverberates through the continent today. The Cameroonian War for Independence started around 1955, a few years after slavery was declared illegal globally in 1948. Today, slavery is illegal in almost all countries, but there is something else in its place. In the United States, the journey to emancipation was long and arduous. Despite Congress outlawing the slave trade in 1808, the institution of slavery itself stubbornly persisted, particularly in the southern states. Even when Abraham Lincoln took office, hoping to steer the nation towards unity, 7 southern states defiantly seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. When the Civil War began, 4 more joined their cause. Amidst the chaos, Lincoln's Union troops made the abolition of slavery a central aim, not just out of moral obligation, but also as a military necessity. The tide of war itself became a catalyst for the self-emancipation of countless enslaved individuals who sought refuge behind Union lines, fleeing the bondage that had shackled them for generations. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, he made it official that slaves within any state or designated part of a state in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free. On Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, about 3 million enslaved people were freed, and the Confederacy was deprived of its labor force. While the Emancipation Proclamation sought to end slavery, it didn't officially end until the passage of the 13th Amendment after the end of the Civil War in 1865. After the adoption of the 13th Amendment, enslaved men and women received the rights of citizenship. The 14th Amendment aimed to ensure equal protection, and the 15th Amendment aimed to ensure the right to vote. But despite the adoption, Black people still find it challenging to gain a foothold in the post-war economy, even today. Reconstruction was frustrating for African Americans, and the need to dominate and oppress a race considered to be inferior was expressed in the form of racism and implemented by racist legislation. Racism birthed racial segregation, and laws like the Jim Crow laws enforced it. These laws were introduced in the southern United States, where we had white-dominated state legislatures that were doing everything in their power to disenfranchise and remove the political and economic gains made by African Americans during the Reconstruction era. Movements like the Lily White Movement, which was an anti-Black political movement within the Republican Party in the 19th and early 20th centuries, supported racial segregation. However, racial segregation was allowed to stand for too long. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1975 brought about the changes necessary to bring the chapter on racial segregation to a close. It has been years since the abolition, Reconstruction, and the Jim Crow laws, but Black people still struggle with economic disparity. And that's because of how long we were held back by racism. Time is the most valuable currency. Slavery and laws like the Jim Crow laws and racial segregation robbed African Americans of time they could have spent building up their economic worth. Now that they are being granted access and equality, the gap and disparity exists because white America has gotten a huge head start to the tune of 300 to 400 years. One African American cannot achieve what generations of white families have been able to achieve because of the competition and a gap that already exists. Racism cuts across both parties, whether African American or African.
If opportunity is right here, they will give it to people of other race than African American. and Africans too.
However, Africans who haven't made their way to the Western world see racism differently because they were raised through struggle. It's a frustrating reality that persists. The misconception that basic amenities somehow negate the existence of racism. African Americans often find themselves unfairly labeled as privileged or lazy because they have access to essentials like water, electricity, and healthcare. Yet this narrative crumbles when Africans confront the harsh reality of racism in the Western world. Experiencing racism firsthand can be a profound awakening for many. It's not just about being judged by appearances or denied opportunities based on skin color. It's about facing systemic discrimination that permeates every aspect of your life. The tragic murder of George Floyd stands as a stark reminder that racism is not a relic of the past, but an ongoing pervasive issue that continues to haunt our society. Now, while racism undeniably exists, it's essential to avoid reflexively blaming it for every setback or rejection. Yes, racism is a significant barrier, but it's not the sole determinant of our destinies. We can challenge and overcome these obstacles to carve out our paths independent of the systems that seek to hold us back. The civil rights movement of the 1960s fought for equality, for the right to be treated as equals with dignity and respect. And while progress has been made, it's clear that true equality remains elusive. Black-owned businesses have often been overlooked and marginalized, while the allure of corporate America beckons to many. Racism, rooted in the legacy of slavery, has undoubtedly shaped the mindset of Black individuals, fostering a desire to integrate into the system that has historically oppressed them. James Truslow Adams popularized the notion of the American dream during the Great Depression in 1931. At its core, this dream promises everyone the freedom and opportunity to achieve success and a better life regardless of background. However, the question remains, is the American dream truly accessible to people of color? For many Africans, the American dream represents the ultimate goal, a beacon of hope, promising opportunities beyond what they could ever find in their home countries. The belief that hard work and determination can lead to prosperity resonates deeply, driving them to leave behind familiar shores in search of greener pastures. Yet, for African Americans, the reality is far more complex. Centuries of racism, segregation, and economic oppression have cast a long shadow over their pursuit of the American dream. The very system upon which this dream was built was designed to benefit white America, often at the expense of communities of color. It's a harsh truth that cannot be ignored.
Why would we dream of being equal in a system that wasn't designed for us?
The American dream highlights freedom and opportunity, but hasn't precisely proffered an equal playing field for everyone. However, the American dream is subjective in the sense that people can have their own American dream. To many Africans, the specifics of who dominates corporate America matters less than the promise of a better life. The pursuit of the American dream transcends racial boundaries, driven by a universal desire for prosperity and security. White America might dominate corporate America, but white people are not the only ones entitled to the American dream. If the American dream weren't meant for everyone or did not present opportunities to everyone regardless of race, no one would chase the American dream. Corporate America is not the only aspect of American society that white America dominates. Did you know that as of 2021, 73.4% of the police officers' workforce were white, of which 11.8% were women and 88.2% were men?
I trust law enforcement.
I don't have a thing to say.
All right, can the disagreeer step forward?
Africans and African Americans share a common distrust for law enforcement, and for a good reason. Let's take you back to how law enforcement was invented. The origins of modern-day policing go all the way back to slave patrols. When one thinks about early policing in America, images like a county sheriff settling a rift between neighbors or constables serving arrest warrants come to mind. But the truth was that law enforcement was born out of a need to prevent slave rebellions. The American South relied heavily on enslaved people for its economy. White Southerners were almost always afraid that slave uprisings would upset the region's established economic order. These patrols were, therefore, among the most established and widespread types of early police in the South. Patrol's simple duty was to regulate the habits and the movements of enslaved populations. Slave patrols were created for three primary purposes. 1. To find, capture, and deliver runaway slaves back to their owners. 2. To offer a kind of coordinated terror to prevent slave uprisings. And 3. To uphold a system of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside the law. Listen to the North Carolina Slave Patrol oath. I, insert patroller's name, do swear that I will, as a searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and as privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs, to be the best of my power, so help me God. The history of law enforcement in the United States, particularly in the South, is deeply intertwined with the legacy of slavery and oppression. The brutal tactics employed by slave patrols to control and subjugate African Americans during the era of slavery laid the foundation for what would eventually become modern policing. Slave patrols operated with a sense of authority bestowed upon them by local authorities, making their violent actions seem like a civic duty rather than outright brutality. Even after the abolition of slavery, the influence of these patrols lingered on, with Southern police departments effectively continuing their practices in the post-Civil War era. The transition from slave patrols to modern law enforcement was not a clean break. Instead, it carried over many of the same tactics and attitudes, making it difficult for African Americans to trust the police. Moreover, the ongoing issues of police brutality, prejudice, racial profiling, and wrongful imprisonment only serve to deepen this distrust. Across the United States, African Americans continue to face disproportionate levels of violence and discrimination at the hands of law enforcement, perpetuating a cycle of fear and suspicion. However, this problem isn't even limited to the United States. In Africa, law enforcement has a dark history rooted in colonization. The practices of colonial powers like England laid the groundwork for modern policing in African countries, often prioritizing control and oppression over justice and protection. Recent events in countries like Senegal and Nigeria underscore the continued struggles against police brutality and state violence. From protests against election postponements to movements like the EndSARS, African communities are demanding accountability and justice from law enforcement agencies that all too often operate with impunity. In both the United States and Africa, the legacy of oppression and violence perpetrated by law enforcement institutions underscores the urgent need for reform and accountability. It's pretty clear that the history of law enforcement, both in the United States and Africa, is pretty messy. From the brutal tactics of slave patrols to the ongoing struggles against police brutality today, it's like we're still dealing with the ghosts of the past. In the US, the legacy of slavery has left deep scars on the relationship between African Americans and law enforcement. Even though things have technically changed since the Civil War, the trust issues linger on, fueled by ongoing incidents of violence and discrimination. And it's not just an American problem. Over in Africa, the echoes of colonialism still reverberate through the corridors of law enforcement, with similar struggles against brutality and injustice. But here's the thing. Slavery has affected us all, and recognizing the problem is the first step towards fixing it. By confronting the dark history of slavery and working together, we could turn the tide and create a world where everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of skin color.